Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the only one worth seeing. The ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Gala shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. Soft music floated through the air while servers in white gloves moved between guests carrying silver trays of champagne. Every corner of the Grand Manhattan Hotel seemed designed to impress. Politicians mingled with celebrities. Fortune 500 executives exchanged polished smiles. Cameras flashed beneath towering floral arrangements imported from California. It was the kind of event where every guest belonged to a world of power, wealth, and influence. Elena Hartwell did not. Standing near the entrance, she adjusted the sleeve of a navy blue dress she had borrowed from her cousin only 3 hours earlier. The dress fit well enough, but she could still feel how out of place she was. Around her, women wore designer gowns worth thousands of dollars. Their confidence filled the room as naturally as the music. Elena lowered her gaze. She had spent the afternoon sketching illustrations for a children's publishing company from her tiny apartment in Queens. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. Her cousin had received the invitation months ago but woke up sick that morning and begged Elena to take her place. First she refused. Then she gave in. Now she was questioning every decision that had brought her here. Her fingers tightened around the small navy sketchbook hidden inside her clutch. It was her security blanket, the thing she carried whenever anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. "You can do this," she whispered quietly to herself. Unfortunately, confidence wasn't something she could draw onto a page. Across the ballroom, a cluster of elegant women had already gathered around the man everyone seemed interested in. Dorian Whitmore. Even from a distance, Elena recognized him immediately. His face appeared regularly on magazine covers and business publications. Founder of Whitmore Dynamics. Billionaire entrepreneur. One of the most influential men in America. Tall, composed, and effortlessly charismatic, he stood near the center of attention while guests subtly competed for a few moments of his time. 5 women seemed particularly determined. They were beautiful, polished, and perfectly at home in the luxurious environment. Every laugh appeared calculated. Every glance carefully practiced. Elena looked away almost immediately. That world had nothing to do with her. She reached for a glass of champagne from a passing tray, hoping it would give her something to do besides standing awkwardly near the wall. Taking a slow breath, she turned toward a quieter corner of the room. At the exact same moment, someone stepped backward unexpectedly. Elena collided with them. The glass slipped from her fingers. Cold champagne splashed across the front of her dress. The crystal flute shattered harmlessly against the carpeted floor. Conversations nearby paused. Heads turned. A few people stared. Heat rushed into Elena's face. "Oh no," she breathed. The woman she had bumped into barely glanced at her. "You should watch where you're going." A few nearby guests exchanged amused looks. Someone chuckled softly. Elena wished the floor would open beneath her feet. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. Without waiting for a response, she hurried away from the crowd, clutching her bag tightly against her side. She moved through a side hallway and finally reached a quieter section near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Her heart pounded. Beyond the glass, thousands of city lights stretched toward the horizon. Inside her chest, embarrassment twisted into frustration. Why had she agreed to come? Why did she think she could belong in a place like this? Taking a shaky breath, she opened her clutch and removed her sketchbook. The familiar sight immediately calmed her. She flipped to a blank page and began sketching the city lights outside. Simple lines. Gentle shadows. Familiar motions. Little by little, her heartbeat slowed. She became so focused on the drawing that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching from behind. And, for the first time that evening, the billionaire every woman seemed determined to impress quietly stopped and watched the shy girl who had no idea he was standing there. For a few seconds, Dorian Whitmore simply stood there in silence. It was a rare experience. Most people noticed him immediately. They straightened their posture. They changed their tone. They became more careful with their words. But the young woman by the window seemed completely unaware of his presence. Her attention remained fixed on the small sketchbook resting in her hands. The city lights reflected across the page as her pencil moved steadily. Dorian found himself curious, not about the drawing itself but about the person creating it. He had spent the last hour trapped in conversations that felt rehearsed. Compliments disguised as introductions. Business pitches disguised as friendly remarks. Every interaction carried an agenda. Yet this woman had fled the ballroom at the first opportunity. That alone made her different. Finally he stepped closer. That is impressive. Elena nearly dropped her pencil. Her head snapped up. Oh. She quickly closed the sketchbook halfway. Sorry. I did not realize anyone was there. I can see that. There was amusement in his voice. You draw professionally? Elena relaxed slightly. He was well dressed, but then again everyone here was. She assumed he was another guest escaping the crowd. Mostly freelance illustration, she said. Books. Small projects. Anything that pays the rent. Dorian nodded. And tonight? She laughed nervously. Tonight I am apparently embarrassing myself at expensive events. The corner of his mouth lifted. The champagne incident? Elena groaned. Please do not remind me. I thought you handled it well. By running away? By surviving it. That earned a genuine smile. For the first time all evening, Elena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The stranger's calm demeanor made conversation surprisingly easy. You are very kind, she said. Most people in there probably disagree. Most people in there seem very busy trying to impress each other. Dorian glanced toward the ballroom doors. You noticed that too? Elena laughed softly. It is impossible not to. And yet you are hiding out here drawing windows instead. She looked down at the page. People are easier to understand on paper. How so? Elena hesitated before answering. A drawing only captures what feels real, not what someone wants others to see. The statement caught Dorian off guard. He looked at her more carefully. There was no performance in her voice, no attempt to sound profound. She was simply being honest. It was refreshing. That sounds like something an artist would say. Maybe. She smiled. Or maybe I am just socially awkward. I doubt that. Trust me. I have years of evidence. They both laughed. For several moments they stood side by side overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Below them, streams of headlights moved through the streets like ribbons of light. Somewhere behind the ballroom walls, applause erupted from another speech. Neither seemed eager to return. So what do you do? Elena asked. Dorian almost smiled at the familiar question. Usually people already knew the answer. I work with businesses. That sounds mysterious. It is actually very boring. I do not believe that. No. No one says their job is boring unless it is secretly complicated. Dorian laughed. You might be right. Elena studied him for a moment. There was something unusual about him. He carried himself with confidence but not arrogance. Unlike many guests she had encountered tonight, he seemed genuinely interested in listening. You do not seem like everyone else here, she said before she could stop herself. Neither do you. Their eyes met briefly. Elena looked away first. To break the awkwardness, she reopened her sketchbook. Do you want to see? The drawing? Yes. Dorian stepped closer. The page showed the city skyline, but that was not what caught his attention. Along the edge of the sketch were small observations from the gala itself. A server balancing a tray. An elderly couple laughing together. A nervous guest adjusting his tie. Tiny moments most people overlooked. Dorian stared at them quietly. For the first time that evening, someone had captured the humanity of the room instead of its wealth. And, without realizing it, Elena Hartwell had just become the most interesting person at his gala. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dorian continued studying the sketchbook while Elena suddenly felt self-conscious. She was not used to showing her drawings to strangers, especially at a gala filled with people who probably spent more on a single dinner than she earned from an illustration project. They are just quick sketches, she said. Nothing special. Dorian slowly shook his head. I disagree. Elena looked at him. You do. Most people walk into a room and notice the most expensive thing. He glanced back at the page. You noticed the people. Something warm stirred inside her chest. It was a simple compliment, but it felt genuine. Before she could respond, the distant sound of laughter echoed from the ballroom. A group of guests entered the hallway nearby before quickly moving past. The interruption broke the quiet atmosphere between them. Elena closed the sketchbook and slipped it back into her clutch. I should probably go back before my cousin starts getting blamed for my disappearance. Dorian smiled. That would be unfortunate. Together they began walking toward the ballroom entrance. The moment they stepped inside, the contrast felt immediate. Music, crystal lights, endless conversations. The energy of the event swallowed them again. Almost instantly, someone approached Dorian. A striking brunette in a silver designer gown touched his arm lightly. There you are, she said with a practiced smile. Everyone has been looking for you. Elena noticed the subtle shift in the woman's expression when she looked at Dorian. Recognition, interest, calculation. Dorian remained polite. I stepped away for some air. Well, you cannot hide all evening. The woman laughed. The auction begins soon. Her gaze briefly landed on Elena before returning to him. We have been waiting. Elena suddenly felt like an outsider again. I should go, she said quietly. Dorian turned toward her. It was nice meeting you, Elena. She blinked. She had forgotten she told him her name earlier. You too. Then she disappeared into the crowd. Dorian watched her go. Something about that bothered him more than it should have. Who is she? The brunette asked casually. A guest. Interesting. Dorian offered no further explanation. Within minutes he found himself surrounded once again. The brunette was joined by 4 other women who had spent most of the evening competing for his attention. One was the daughter of a senator. Another ran a luxury fashion brand. A third had become famous through social media and business investments. The remaining 2 came from families whose names appeared regularly in financial publications. They were beautiful, accomplished, intelligent. Under different circumstances, Dorian might have enjoyed their company. Tonight felt different. Dorian, you absolutely must visit St. Tropez this summer, one woman said. You would love it. I practically live there now, another added. The networking opportunities are incredible. Have you seen the Aspen property I mentioned? Asked a third. I could arrange a private tour. Their voices blended together. Polished. Perfect. Predictable. Dorian responded when necessary, but his attention kept drifting elsewhere. Across the ballroom, near a large arrangement of white roses, Elena stood alone again. She had reopened her sketchbook. While everyone else seemed focused on status, influence, and appearances, she appeared completely absorbed in observing the room itself. Every few minutes she added another sketch, another detail, another story hidden inside the crowd. Dorian found himself wondering what she was drawing now. Are you listening? One of the women asked suddenly. Of course. Then what did I just say? Dorian smiled politely. Something about Aspen. The group laughed, assuming he was joking. But for the first time all evening, Dorian Whitmore realized he was not interested in any conversation happening around him. Because despite being surrounded by 5 remarkable women who were all trying to capture his attention, the only person he wanted to talk to was the shy artist standing quietly on the other side of the room. Elena tried to focus on the gala instead of the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. She moved quietly through the ballroom, stopping occasionally near different groups of guests as she added more sketches to her notebook. Drawing had always helped her make sense of people. Growing up, she had spent hours sitting in parks, coffee shops, and subway stations, filling pages with strangers and the stories she imagined behind their expressions. Tonight felt no different, except the room around her looked like something from another world. A waiter carrying a tray of sparkling water. An elderly donor laughing so hard he nearly spilled his drink. A young employee nervously rehearsing a speech near one of the marble columns. Elena captured them all. Small moments. Real moments. The kind nobody else seemed to notice. Across the ballroom, Dorian found himself watching her again. Every time he attempted to return his attention to the conversations around him, his gaze drifted back to the same person. He noticed the way she tilted her head slightly whenever she studied a subject. The way she smiled to herself after finishing a sketch. The way she seemed completely unaware that several of the most influential people in New York were standing only a few feet away. "You seem distracted tonight," one of the women beside him observed. Dorian glanced toward her. "Doi. You have checked your watch 3 times in 2 minutes. Maybe I am getting old." The group laughed politely. The woman touched his arm again. "I highly doubt that." Dorian smiled, but his attention had already shifted elsewhere. A few minutes later, the Gala string quartet began playing a softer piece as guests moved toward the central exhibition area, where several charitable initiatives were being presented. Elena wandered in the same direction. Along one wall, photographs displayed stories of families helped by the foundation. She paused in front of a large image showing volunteers rebuilding homes after a storm. Something about the photograph felt honest, human. Without thinking, she opened her sketchbook again. Nearby, Dorian quietly approached. "What caught your attention this time?" Elena looked up and smiled. "You again. I hope that is not a complaint." "Not yet." Dorian laughed. "Fair enough." She turned the sketchbook slightly toward him. "Everyone is looking at the people in the photograph. And you are not?" "No," she pointed toward a small detail near the corner. "Look." Dorian leaned closer. "The volunteer?" "Exactly. The man was barely visible in the original image. Most people would never notice him." "Everyone sees the finished house," Elena said softly. "Nobody sees the person carrying lumber in the background." Dorian studied the picture. Then he looked at her. "You always notice things like that?" "I guess so." "Why?" Elena considered the question. "Because people spend too much time trying to be impressive." Her eyes drifted across the ballroom. "The things that matter are usually quieter." For a moment Dorian said nothing. The answer stayed with him longer than he expected. In his world, attention was everything. Headlines, recognition, public success. Yet standing beside Elena, he realized how rarely anyone paid attention to the smaller things. The human things. "Can I see the rest?" he asked. Elena hesitated. "The sketches. If you do not mind." Slowly, she handed him the notebook. Dorian opened it carefully. The first page showed the Manhattan skyline. The second captured a pair of elderly guests sharing a private joke. Another featured a nervous server balancing a tray. Another showed a donor wiping away tears during a charity presentation. Page after page revealed moments nobody else had seen. Dorian turned another page and froze. There, sketched with simple pencil lines, was a man standing alone near a ballroom window. His expression was thoughtful, almost tired, vulnerable in a way few people ever saw. Elena immediately reached for the notebook. "Oh no, I was not supposed to show you that one." But Dorian barely heard her. Because for the first time in years, someone had not drawn him as a billionaire, a public figure, or a symbol of success. Somehow, this shy young woman had drawn the person hidden underneath all of it. Elena's face turned bright red as she reached for the sketchbook. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I should not have drawn that." Dorian looked up from the page. "Why not?" "Because it is rude." "I do not think it is." She folded her arms nervously. "Most people do not enjoy being secretly sketched." Dorian glanced back at the drawing. "Most people are probably not being drawn this honestly." For a second, neither spoke. The noise of the gala continued around them, but the moment felt strangely private. Then a familiar voice interrupted. "There you are, Dorian." Elena turned. The brunette in the silver gown had returned, accompanied by 2 of the other women who had spent most of the evening surrounding him. Their smiles appeared pleasant enough, but Elena immediately sensed something changing in the atmosphere. "Everyone is waiting for you," the brunette said. "The board members want a few minutes before the next presentation." Her eyes shifted toward Elena's sketchbook. "Oh, am I interrupting an art lesson?" The comment sounded playful, yet something underneath it felt sharp. Elena instinctively closed the notebook. "Not at all," she said. One of the other women tilted her head slightly. "I do not think we have met." Elena Hartul. "Interesting." The woman smiled. "Which foundation are you representing?" Elena hesitated. "None." "A donor then?" "No, business partner." No, the smiles became slightly tighter. How did you receive an invitation? Elena felt uncomfortable. My cousin was invited. She became sick this morning, so she asked me to come in her place. A brief silence followed. The women exchanged quick glances. The brunette laughed softly. So you are not actually supposed to be here. Caroline, Dorian said calmly. But Caroline continued. I am just surprised, that is all. Most guests wait years to attend this gala. Elena forced a polite smile. I understand. Another woman looked toward the sketchbook. And what exactly have you been doing all evening? Drawing. Drawing. She laughed. At one of the most exclusive events in New York City? Elena suddenly wished she could disappear. It helps me relax. How charming. The words sounded complimentary. The tone did not. Nearby guests had begun paying attention. Nothing dramatic. Just subtle curiosity. A few sideways glances. A few quiet observations. Elena felt every one of them. Caroline folded her arms. Let me guess. You are an artist. Illustrator mostly. Freelance. Elena nodded. That must be difficult. Sometimes. I cannot imagine. Caroline smiled again. Living project to project sounds exhausting. Dorian's expression hardened slightly. He recognized exactly what was happening. The comments remained polite enough to avoid open confrontation, but the intention was obvious. They were measuring Elena, testing her, determining whether she belonged, and in their minds she clearly did not. Elena lowered her gaze. She had encountered people like this before. People who judged value based on income, status, or social connections. Usually she ignored it. Tonight felt different because suddenly she was standing under a spotlight she never wanted. I think her sketches are remarkable, Dorian said. The women looked at him. Caroline laughed lightly. Of course you do. I mean it. His voice remained calm. She notices things most people miss. Elena glanced at him surprised. For a brief second she felt grateful. Then another woman spoke. That is lovely, but noticing things and changing things are not exactly the same. Several nearby guests chuckled politely. Elena felt her stomach tighten. She knew she should walk away. The evening had already become far more uncomfortable than she wanted. Excuse me, she said quietly. I should probably get some fresh air. Before anyone could respond, she stepped away from the group. Her heels carried her quickly through the ballroom as she tried to ignore the heat rising in her face. She hated attention. She hated judgment even more. Behind her, Dorian watched her leave. The smile had vanished from his face entirely. For the first time that evening, he was no longer irritated by the behavior of the women surrounding him. He was disappointed. Because while they had spent the entire night trying to impress him with their accomplishments, influence, and social status, the one person in the room who possessed genuine humility had just been made to feel unwelcome. And somehow that bothered him far more than it should have. Elena pushed through the ballroom doors and stepped into a quieter corridor overlooking the hotel's private terrace. The cool air from outside slipped through the partially open glass doors and immediately eased the tension in her chest. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the Manhattan skyline. Thousands of lights glittered across the darkness, each window belonging to a life completely separate from her own. She should have left. The thought crossed her mind more than once. She could call a rideshare, go back to Queens, change into sweatpants, and spend the rest of the night sketching in peace. Instead, she remained where she was. Maybe because part of her still felt disappointed. Not because of the comments from the women. She had dealt with people like that before. What bothered her was how foolish she suddenly felt. For a few hours, she had almost forgotten she was the outsider in the room. A burst of applause echoed from inside the ballroom. Then another. Curious, Elena stepped back toward the entrance. Guests were gathering around the main stage. The evening's largest presentation appeared to be starting. Large screens illuminated the room. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across hundreds of faces. Elena quietly slipped into a position near the back of the crowd, hoping to remain unnoticed. On stage, the master of ceremonies smiled confidently. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. Your generosity continues to change lives across this country. More applause followed.
Elena Listenet Politelli.
Then the host continued. And now, it is my honor to introduce the visionary behind this evening, the founder of Whitmore Dynamics, chairman of the Whitmore Foundation, one of the nation's most influential philanthropists. Please welcome Mr. Dorian Whitmore. The room erupted. Applause thundered through the ballroom.
Elena froze.
Her heart stopped for a fraction of a second. Slowly, almost mechanically, she lifted her gaze toward the stage. Dorian walked into the spotlight. Calm, confident,
Familiar.
the same man who had stood beside her at the window, the same man who had looked through her sketchbook, the same man she thought was simply another guest. Suddenly everything clicked into place. The attention, the respect, the way people reacted whenever he entered a room. Elena felt her stomach drop. No, she whispered under her breath. Dorian stepped behind the podium. Cameras flashed from every direction. Guests leaned forward eagerly. The 5 women from earlier stood near the front, smiling proudly as though they already belonged beside him. Elena barely heard the first part of his speech. Her thoughts were racing too fast. He knew exactly who he was the entire time. Yet he never told her. Not once. She remembered asking what he did for a living. He had answered vaguely. She remembered wondering why everyone seemed to know him. She remembered how comfortable she felt talking to him. Now every conversation replayed differently in her mind. The distance between them suddenly seemed enormous. She was a freelance illustrator struggling to make rent payments. He was one of the wealthiest men in America. The realization stung more than she expected. On stage, Dorian continued speaking about the foundation's projects, educational programs, and community investments. The audience listened attentively. Elena noticed something else. Despite the polished speech, despite the cameras and applause, he occasionally scanned the crowd, as though searching for someone. Then his eyes found her. For a brief moment, the rest of the room seemed to disappear. Elena immediately looked away. A strange mixture of embarrassment and disappointment settled over her. She was not angry. Not exactly. But she felt foolish for believing their conversation had happened between equals. The applause erupted again as Dorian concluded his remarks. Elena barely joined in. Around her, guests praised the speech. Investors discussed future partnerships. Journalists prepared questions. The gala had returned to its normal rhythm. Yet for Elena, everything had changed. Because the man she thought she understood was no longer a mystery guest at a charity event. He was Dorian Whitmore. And for the first time that night, she was not sure whether she wanted to speak to him again. The applause gradually faded, but the anticipation inside the ballroom only grew stronger. Guests returned to their tables while servers refreshed drinks and cleared empty glasses. Large screens on both sides of the stage displayed images from the Whitmore Foundation's newest initiative, a nationwide program designed to support young artists and community education projects. Elena remained near the back of the room. She considered leaving more than once. Every instinct told her to slip out quietly before anyone noticed. Yet something kept her rooted in place. Maybe curiosity. Maybe disappointment. Maybe the unanswered questions still circling inside her mind. On stage, Dorian listened as the master of ceremonies introduced the foundation's next announcement. Tonight, the host said, we are proud to unveil a new creative leadership initiative. This program will be represented by one individual, whose vision reflects the values we hope to share across the country. A murmur spread through the audience. Several guests immediately began speculating. Elena noticed the 5 women near the front exchanging confident smiles. They clearly expected one of them to receive the role. Honestly, so did everyone else. Each woman possessed the perfect credentials: wealth, connections, public recognition. They looked exactly like the kind of representatives organizations usually selected. The chosen ambassador, the host continued, will help guide future projects and become the public face of this initiative. The room grew even quieter. Cameras shifted toward the front rows. Caroline sat a little straighter. Another woman adjusted her posture and smiled toward a photographer. Elena barely paid attention. She was already reaching for her purse, preparing to leave the moment the announcement ended. Then Dorian stepped forward. He accepted a microphone and looked across the crowd. For several seconds he said nothing. His gaze moved slowly from table to table. The room became completely silent. When people think about leadership, he began, they usually think about achievement, titles, influence, visibility. Several guests nodded. But tonight reminded me of something important. The people who create the greatest impact are not always the loudest voices in the room. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Something about the way he spoke felt personal. Sometimes, Dorian continued, the people worth noticing are the ones quietly paying attention while everyone else is trying to be noticed. The ballroom remained motionless. Even the photographer seemed to pause. Dorian looked toward the front rows where the 5 women sat waiting. Then he stepped away from the podium. Confused whispers spread through the crowd as he walked directly off the stage. One camera operator hurried to follow him. Then another. Elena watched in disbelief as Dorian crossed the ballroom floor. He moved past the first woman, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Every head in the room turned to follow him. Caroline's smile disappeared. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. Nobody understood what was happening. Elena certainly did not. Her heart pounded as Dorian continued walking, straight toward her. "No," she whispered under her breath. "This cannot be happening." Yet it was. He stopped only a few feet away. Hundreds of eyes immediately shifted in her direction.
Elena froze.
"Mr. Whitmore?" she managed to say. Dorian smiled softly. "You once said that people spend too much time trying to be impressive." Elena felt her face grow warm. "I did. And you were right." The room remained silent. Waiting. Watching. Dorian turned toward the audience. "The person I have chosen understands something that cannot be taught in a boardroom or purchased with influence." He looked back at Elena. "She sees people." For a moment nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Dorian extended his hand. "Elena Hartwell," he said clearly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "You are my choice." Gasps echoed across the room. Camera flashes exploded from every direction. Elena stared at him in complete shock. Around her, guests looked stunned. The 5 women stood frozen near the front. Reporters immediately began whispering questions. Yet Elena barely heard any of it. Because standing in the center of one of the most prestigious events in New York City, surrounded by power, wealth, and expectation, the last person anyone imagined would be chosen had suddenly become the only person everyone was looking at. Elena could barely hear the applause. It seemed distant now, muffled beneath the rush of emotions flooding her mind. Hundreds of people were staring at her. Reporters were taking photographs. The 5 women who had dominated the evening stood speechless near the front of the ballroom. Yet the only thing Elena could focus on was Dorian's outstretched hand. Slowly, almost uncertainly, she accepted it. Another wave of applause rolled through the room. Dorian guided her toward the stage while flashes of light followed them from every direction. Elena felt as though she had stepped into someone else's life. Moments earlier she had been preparing to leave. Now she stood beside one of the most powerful men in the country. "You do not have to say anything," Dorian said quietly as they reached the stage. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "Good," Elena replied honestly. "Because I cannot think of a single thing to say." A faint smile appeared on his face. The audience laughed softly as though they sensed the exchange. The remainder of the presentation passed in a blur. Dorian spoke about the new initiative and its mission to support creativity in underserved communities. Elena listened, but her thoughts remained tangled. Every few minutes she glanced toward him, still struggling to reconcile the man beside her with the stranger she had met near the window. When the formal presentation finally ended, guests surged forward. Journalists wanted interviews. Donors wanted introductions. Executives wanted meetings. Before long, the ballroom became a maze of conversations. Elena quietly slipped away. She needed a moment to breathe. A few minutes later she found herself standing inside a smaller gallery room connected to the hotel. The space had been reserved for private exhibits and foundation displays. The room was empty except for soft lighting and a collection of framed photographs along the walls. "I thought I might find you here." Elena turned. Dorian stood in the doorway. For a moment neither spoke. Then Elena folded her arms. You could have told me. Dorian nodded. I could have. When I asked what you did, you could have told me. Yes. When we first met, you could have told me. Yes.
Elena sighed.
Why did you not? Dorian stepped farther into the room. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone was talking to me instead of talking to Dorian Whitmore. The answer caught her off guard. That sounds convenient. It happens to be true. He leaned lightly against a nearby display. Do you know how many people approached me tonight because of my company, my money, or my influence? Elena looked away. Probably a lot. Almost everyone. His voice softened. You never once asked about any of those things. The room grew quiet. Dorian reached into his jacket and carefully removed something. Elena immediately recognized it. Her sketchbook. You left this on the stage. Her eyes widened. I thought I lost it. I know. He handed it back to her. Before returning it, I looked through the rest.
Elena groaned.
That is not reassuring. Actually, it is. He opened the sketchbook to several pages. One contained the elderly couple laughing together. Another showed the nervous waiter. Another captured volunteers displayed in the foundation photographs. Then he stopped at the sketch of himself standing alone by the window. This one is my favorite. Elena felt embarrassed again. I still cannot believe you saw that. I am glad I did. His gaze remained on the drawing. Do you know what surprised me? She shook her head. You drew everyone the same way. What does that mean? The billionaire, the waiter, the donor, the volunteer. He looked up at her. You saw them all as people first.
Elena stood quietly.
Dorian closed the sketchbook and returned it to her hands. That is why I chose you. For the first time since the reveal, she saw complete sincerity in his eyes. No performance. No public image. Just honesty. And suddenly she understood that his choice had never been about making a statement to the crowd. It had been about recognizing the one person in the room who had quietly seen him for who he really was. 1 year later, the same city sparkled beneath the evening sky. But Elena Hartwell's life looked completely different. The creative initiative that began with one unexpected decision had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Community art programs had opened across multiple states. Scholarships had helped young artists pursue opportunities they once believed were impossible. What started as a single project had become a movement. Yet despite the media attention, interviews, and public recognition, Elena remained exactly who she had always been. She still carried the same navy sketchbook everywhere she went. She still preferred observing conversations rather than dominating them. And she still felt most comfortable with a pencil in her hand. Tonight, she stood inside a renovated gallery in Manhattan preparing for the opening of her first major exhibition. The walls displayed dozens of original pieces created throughout the past year. Donors, artists, educators, and community leaders filled the space. Soft music drifted through the gallery while guests admired the artwork. Elena moved quietly among them, greeting visitors and answering questions. Every so often she caught herself smiling. A year ago she had arrived at a luxury gala feeling completely out of place. Now she stood surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the work she helped create. Across the room, Dorian Whitmore watched her with unmistakable pride. Their relationship had grown slowly after that night. There had been conversations, disagreements, laughter, and long walks through Central Park. There had been moments when Elena questioned whether she belonged in his world. And there had been moments when Dorian admitted how exhausted he had become from living inside expectations that never truly reflected who he was. Together they had learned something simple. The distance between two people was never measured by money. It was measured by honesty. As the evening continued, the gallery director approached the microphone. Before we conclude tonight's celebration, there is one final piece we would like to share. Guests turned toward the center of the room. Elena looked confused. She had not been told about any additional presentation. Dorian stepped forward carrying a familiar object. The moment Elena saw it, her breath caught. Her navy sketchbook. The very same one she had carried into the gala a year earlier. Soft laughter spread through the crowd as Dorian carefully opened it. This sketchbook changed my life, he said. Elena immediately shook her head. Please do not do this. The audience laughed again. Dorian smiled. I am afraid it is too late. He slowly turned several pages. The guests saw sketches of volunteers, families, city streets, and quiet moments that most people would have overlooked. Then he reached the final page. The room grew silent. There, beautifully drawn in pencil, was a portrait of Dorian standing near a ballroom window. The same moment from the night they first met. Beneath the sketch, written in Elena's handwriting, was a single sentence. The man who saw me when nobody else did. Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Elena felt her eyes begin to sting as well. Dorian closed the sketchbook and looked directly at her. A year ago, everyone in that ballroom thought they knew exactly who I should choose. The room listened attentively. They were wrong. His voice softened. The best decision I made that night was walking toward the one person who never tried to impress me. Then, to Elena's complete surprise, he lowered himself onto one knee. A collective gasp filled the gallery. Elena covered her mouth with both hands. Dorian held out a small ring. Elena Hartwell, he said, smiling through unmistakable emotion. Thank you for seeing people the way they deserve to be seen. Thank you for seeing me. Will you marry me? For a second she could not speak. The room seemed to disappear. There was only Dorian, the sketchbook, the memory of that first conversation near the window. Finally, through tears and laughter, she nodded. Yes. The gallery erupted into applause. Friends cheered. Cameras flashed. But none of it mattered. Because in a room filled with accomplished people, beautiful artwork, and extraordinary success, the most important thing was remarkably simple. Two people had found each other because one chose to notice what everyone else ignored. And sometimes the greatest love stories begin with nothing more than being truly seen. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Chosen by Love. Every subscription helps us bring you more unforgettable billionaire romance stories filled with kindness, courage, second chances, and true love. Share this video with someone who believes that genuine connection matters more than status, and let us know your favorite moment in the story. Thank you for being part of the Chosen by Love family.